Is the European Union still attractive? The bloc with 28 member states is put to the test as Britain votes to remain or leave. But after decades of existence, what's the future of the EU? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Dareen Abughaida. All eyes on the UK as Britons head to the polls to decide whether they want to stay in the European Union or leave. While on the continent, the vote is being watched with much concern. The EU has already been tested to its limits in recent years by a series of financial crises and by the unprecedented movement of refugees and migrants. But if Britons vote to leave, it could prove to be the EU's biggest challenge since its founding. Well, anxiety about the so-called Brexit centers on one major fear for the EU, that it would open the door to a stampede of countries wanting to leave or even renegotiate their own treaties with the organization. Leading European politicians have dismissed that idea that a Brexit would lead to a breakup of the EU. The president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, for instance, thinks that a Brexit could actually lead to even closer integration. What he said is that I don't think the EU will be in danger of death if Britain leaves. We will continue the process of closer cooperation in Europe, if not of deepening the EU and mainly the economic and the monetary union. Well, the problem for European officials is that the anger driving anti-EU sentiments in the UK also exists elsewhere on the continent. A recent Pew survey polled 10,000 people in 10 major EU nations. It found euroskepticism on the rise. 47% had an unfavorable view of the EU. 51% had a favorable view. And the EU was viewed even worse in countries including France, Spain, and Italy. And when people were asked if some powers should be returned back to their national governments, 42% said they should, while 19% said more power should be transferred to the EU. And in 7 out of 10 EU countries, a majority of the public said their country should deal with its own problems and let others fend for themselves. Time now to bring in our guests for this discussion. In Brussels, we have Maria de Mertzis. She's a fellow at the independent research institution Bruegel. In Berlin, Philip Rotman. He's an associate director at the Global Public Policy Institute. Also in Brussels, Pieter Cleppe. He's head of the Brussels office for Open Europe. Welcome to you all. So, Pieter, when the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, says that a Brexit could actually lead to even closer integration of European countries, is he right?
No, he's absolutely wrong. The UK hasn't been preventing Eurozone countries from integrating, quote-unquote, meaning centralizing. On the contrary, David Cameron has been urging the Eurozone to basically flood the financial system with more easy money in a bid to bail out banks in the European periphery. So the reason why people in the north of Europe are not so keen to accept Eurozone transfers is domestic, and the reason why people in the south are not so keen to accept conditions attached to these transfers is also domestic. So the UK is not in any way stopping further Eurozone centralization.
Philip, what do you make of the comments that were made by Jean-Claude Juncker? He's saying that I don't think the EU will be in danger of death if Britain leaves. We will continue the process of closer cooperation in Europe, if not of deepening the EU.
Well, I think it's a bureaucrat's, basically a bureaucrat's answer. He has to give that answer right now. But I think ultimately it will only be true in the sense that there will be more papers, more treaties, and more summits. And I don't think that there's a big risk of countries en masse renegotiating the treaty or trying to drop out. But there is clearly a point of no return in terms of the acceptance and the attractiveness of the European Union as a model to its citizens. And that is a major problem. That is not just a problem connected to Brexit, but it has been growing for the past decade. And it is very much the doing of national politicians in each European member states. I think there's pretty much none that could be taken out of that accusation, and that's a problem that has to be dealt with if the numbers that you cited, the 51% who are not in favor of further European integration, are ever to overcome.
Maria, do you think that a Brexit could be the beginning of the end of the EU and political civilization in the West, as the European Council President Donald Tusk has said?
No, I don't think so. This was very much an emotional appeal, and if it works, so be it. But I really don't think this is going to be the end of the world one way or the other. A lot will depend on the reaction, primarily by the European Union, how we're going to move forward. In the event that there is a Brexit, I think the urgency for the European Union to reform is even bigger. But I think the urgency to reform is there anyway. And I would like to see some strong political leadership here from primarily the big countries, through nature of their size, to actually take this project, move it forward to make it better.
Okay, well, you speak about reform. So would it be a good thing, Maria, if a Brexit were to happen, or even the process of unraveling, or is it a dangerous thing then?
No, I think this is not something that we should wish for. My ideal scenario will be that the UK remains. It is a very valuable partner. It is one that exercises very good leadership, and it can certainly help shape the future of the EU, but we have to respect the results of a democratic process. If they want to leave and follow a different future, that is, of course, their own prerogative. But it would not be a disaster if they were to leave, provided, of course, the European Union seizes the opportunity to reform.
Pieter, Pew Research put out a poll saying that overwhelmingly there is sentiment across Europe that a Brexit would be a bad thing for Europe. For example, 89% in Sweden said that would be a bad thing, 75% of people in the Netherlands, 74% of people in Germany saying the British leaving would not be good for the EU. Is the Brexit a bad thing for the EU?
Well, I think this poll confirms that many people see the British view of the EU as really something that would help the EU further. So indeed, a Brexit may work in different ways. But I think in any case, whether Britain votes to remain or votes to leave, the fact that so many Brits will have voted to leave, even if it's like 45%, means that the European Union needs to be reformed. And then it needs to ask itself the question, why are we so unpopular? And then I think the obvious answer will be, let's not scrap the single market, let's keep the single market, let's keep all the aspects of the European project which are about scrapping trade barriers, but let's perhaps reflect whether we should really intervene into national budget, whether the EU should really organize fiscal transfers, whether it should micromanage asylum decisions of member states. And then I think if the EU would really become more about removing trade barriers again, I predict that the European Union will become a lot more popular again.
Philip, do you agree with this idea of reform needs to be done when it comes to the EU? And if it's the needs of Europeans that the EU was ultimately built on, and those are the foundations, then is the EU not serving Europeans' needs in today's times? And that's why there's talk of reform?
I agree on the fundamentals, but I disagree on what Pieter suggests in the specifics. I think definitely there's a problem in how people see the European Union responding to their hopes and their fears and their interests as they perceive them. That's for sure, and that's why it is so unpopular. But the result, the consequence of that assessment is not to have less Europe, which is what Pieter is suggesting, to go back to the roots of a simple trading bloc, to strip the European Union of all that makes it more of a simple free trade agreement, because the fears and the hopes of Europeans are not just about selling products across borders. They are about getting their whole lives in order and having their existential fears of terrorism, their fears of immigration, but also their hopes and their values in terms of humanitarianism and taking care of people in need, their social needs and everything else, the important issues of life taken care of. And I think Europe, the world is changing. Europe has 500 million people in a world of 7 billion, is a tiny subcontinent, a tiny appendage message to the huge Eurasian continent. We cannot face the rest of the 21st century and beyond as individual countries, trying to each apply our own little procedures on every little piece of political decision making. Ultimately, we will have to come together.
Pieter, I see you shaking your head at Philip.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at opinion polls, like for example the Pew Research poll, it concludes that a majority in 10 member states actually wants to transfer powers back from the EU level back to member states. I think the common theme among these populist movements in Europe, from the left to the right, is that they are not happy that they are losing control over their own fate. One of the slogans of Vote Leave in Britain is also take back control. So I think this is really what people are desiring. And I also think that in a globalized world, we need decentralization. We need very dynamic, decentralized entities, perhaps cities, dealing with the problems. Of course, we need cooperation as well, absolutely, but we definitely don't need supranational cooperation.
Maria, so is the ultimate issue here, you think? I mean, the story obviously is Brexit over the past few days and will continue to be the story over the next few days, but is the ultimate issue for Europeans at large whether governance in Europe should be localized or centralized, as Pieter seems to suggest?
I don't think so. This idea that we can actually do better alone in a world that is so closely interconnected on all issues, from defense, security, refugees, economically, to think that national solutions are better solutions, I think for me is an illusion. Let's see what the power of the UK will be if it chooses to opt out on Thursday. The fact that it can protect its borders better simply by deciding by itself, this cannot be right. And we've seen it during the financial crisis. Coordinated solutions between European countries, but also across the world, were important in order to find and impose effective solutions to very serious problems.
But Maria, at the end of the day, you do have this trend across Europe that is going more towards sort of national referendums on EU issues. So even if there is no Brexit, will that go away, this trend towards national referendums?
Well, I think this is, you're asking the question whether there's going to be less or more populist movements, and I think that has nothing to do with Europe at this point. There is, across the world, there are populist movements, and there are probably legitimate reasons why these populist tendencies have increased. I think we need to address them. However, I don't think that this is in any way jeopardizing the future of Europe. There is one way. We need to move forward. I think I will emphasize that, because if we don't move forward, we will necessarily move backwards.
And what do you mean when you say we need to move forward? How so?
We need to reform the things in Europe that do not work, things like governance. We need to complete banking union. We need to make sure that the single market works better. We need to have a deeply democratic Europe. These are things that we need to reform, and we need to do it credibly. And more importantly, if I may add, we need to engage the citizen.
Okay, Philip, let me just draw your attention to NATO for a second, and the United States, for example, because the US and NATO saying that a Brexit would weaken the unity of the West and its resolve to take on security challenges. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't think it actually makes too much of a difference. Again, this is an appeal to British citizens to vote Remain. And I think as we all agree here on the panel, this would be the better solution for everyone. If alone to not waste a lot of time, probably years, in trying to negotiate the details of a British exit. But if you look at the hard facts in terms of security and defence, there is no reason to really see a major change. NATO remains NATO. Article 5, the clause that has us all defend each other in a case of external attack, will obviously remain in place.
Does Brexit not sort of shake the balance of power in Europe and in fact the global power?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, EU is not. I mean, the core of the West as an ideological model or as a political model has never been the European Union. There's been a transatlantic core, an idea of European countries and the United States working together for a long time, mainly under American leadership, and that has been the core of the West. So I don't think the project of the West depends in any way, shape, or form on particular treaties in Brussels. Even in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of European integration, if you want, a lot of European cooperation outside the EU or in channels that are only vaguely associated with the EU. A lot of bilateral defense treaties that have been added. There's a lot of bilateral integration between individual military units in Europe now. For example, Germans and Dutch are jointly manning a Dutch ship, a combat ship, and there are infantry units being integrated in one another between the Germans and the Dutch on the one side and the Germans and the Poles on the other, which is building on a highly successful German-French model. And there are many other of these examples that don't necessarily depend on the EU itself. And obviously the number of soldiers, the numbers of tanks and so forth are staying the same, and the pressures with pressure on defense budgets to pool some of these funds and to make joint acquisitions will continue to rise. And those joint acquisitions with new airplanes, new ships and so forth, they have been going beyond the confines of the European Union for a long time as well. There have been American, British and so forth defense cooperation for decades. So none of these features will change a lot, and I think the impact on security and defense in the external sense will not be big. It might be much bigger in terms of internal security and the ability of effectively cooperate against terrorism, share information and so forth. But even there, I think the pressures between national governments to find pragmatic, workable solutions will ultimately outweigh any institutional legal trouble as a result of Brexit.
Pieter, do you agree with that assessment? Philip is off the idea that any Brexit doesn't necessarily weaken the foundations of a common European action, neither politically nor economically.
Well, yeah, largely, at least in military terms, the EU does not really have a military arm. It has a lot of things on paper, but in reality, NATO is, of course, the core of Western military cooperation. Also, ideologically, the West includes the United States, which is not in the EU. So the EU is somehow unrelated to that. However, I do think that there are certain risks involved with Brexit. If Britain would vote to leave, it would have to renegotiate a whole series of trade deals. This is not a given. With Open Europe, we've demonstrated that, in theory, at least, it could be possible for the UK to make a success out of Brexit, but there are a number of very serious conditions to be fulfilled. Also, concluding a good deal with the EU will be very important in that. In such a scenario, it will also be in the interest of the European Union not to try to punish the UK, but to respect the Brexit verdict of the British population. Today, Germany's industry came out warning against punishing Britain. I think everyone understands that the stakes are very high, and that even in case of a Brexit vote, the aim should be to open up trade as much as possible between Britain and the continent.
Maria, what are the implications on trade in your opinion? I see you nodding your head there, because let me ask you specifically about the US. When Obama back in April warned that the UK would be, and this is what he said, at the back of the queue in any trade deal with the US if the UK chose to leave the EU.
That's right. This is a practical question. In fact, the European Union has 142 trade treaties across the world. All of this will have to be renegotiated, plus one with the EU. So we need to really start from scratch. This is going to be an incredibly administrative cost for the UK authorities. And God knows what the outcome of these negotiations would be, even if the other parties have best intentions in mind. The average length for trade negotiations is about 28 months, but they could be substantially longer. Can the UK administration actually handle that? I seriously doubt it. And this is, I think, what President Obama and actually a lot of people here in the EU say when they argue that really they're not waiting to start such negotiations.
And Maria, back to the point that you were putting forward about populist sentiment. Let me quote to you another poll here, because this is according to Ipsos Mori. They were saying that 55% of French voters and 58% of Italian voters want referendums of their own. So I got to ask you again, how much of a threat is a contagion after the vote on Brexit or not comes in?
I think it's a substantial risk. It's undeniable. The numbers are what they are, and it would be a mistake to ignore them. However, I think it is important to try and tackle the issue right at the root. Why do we have this populist sentiment, and how can we move back to slightly more sort of mainstream political views in the system? This isn't an easy thing to resolve. It's certainly a challenge, but it's certainly one that is really worthy taking, because we simply cannot let rule disintegrate into the populist vote. I think that would be a mistake. Now, when it comes to national interest, I really think despite that, countries will wait and see. I think it would be difficult to argue that we should have immediately another referendum, simply because the uncertainty that we're going to see surrounding all the negotiations for the UK is enormous. And I'd like to see what will happen on Friday if the financial markets, if the vote is for Brexit.
Philip, do you think that this Brexit, if it were to happen, could really be the start of some process that unravels the EU, and no one knows where it will ultimately end?
Certainly nobody knows. I mean, there is, and the markets show that, as Maria just said, there's a huge amount of uncertainty and fear of what might happen. And as you said, this trend toward more referenda is not pulled out of thin air. We might as well see that, and that's just basically the chickens coming home to roost, because European politicians have for decades and decades treated European integration as a technocratic elite project, have not managed to pull populations along, apart from a few bright moments. And so basically this is now, we're being presented with the consequences of that. And only when we manage, when European elites and especially national politicians, when Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande and hopefully Prime Minister Cameron, after Friday, manage to actually pull their weight and start reforming Europe, yes, but reforming Europe in a direction that Europe actually takes care of people's problems and is seen as taking care of people's problems. And to give you an example, I mean, the ease with which the Paris attackers, the terrorists, were able to move across Europe, despite being known in various intelligence and police databases, but these police services and intelligence services just weren't able to share the data properly. These problems are quite, are unacceptable to populations around Europe. And only if we actually get our act together and reform Europe in a way that Europe actually serves people's day-to-day needs and expectations, will we be able to surmount this crisis. A crisis that will happen, or the crisis that we are in, regardless of the vote on Thursday.
Pieter, is there the political will to go through all of these reforms? And at the end of all of this, what is the EU going to look like, in your opinion?
Well, the answer to a Brexit or a Remain vote with a very high level of Brexit voters should certainly not be to transfer even more powers to the EU. Related to the terrorism cooperation, of course, it's a great idea to try to share information better, but the EU's own anti-terror coordinator has warned that there is no political support whatsoever, and the reason for that is that police, justice matters are very closely interlinked to sovereignty, which on their turn are very closely interlinked to democracy. And democracy is still national. The media is national, the opposition is national, the European Parliament is a failed institution which has not been a check on the EU machinery. On the contrary, it's been a motor. It's always firing up the EU Commission to spend even more, to regulate even more. It always approves EU spending despite the fact that it's very problematic. So the answer should be to listen to voters' concerns. And I think it's pretty clear that most people are in favor of the core of EU cooperation, which is removing trade barriers, and don't want the EU to intervene into sensitive areas.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us, Maria de Mertzis, Philip Rotman and Pieter Cleppe. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story, and thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website or visit us on Facebook or even Twitter. The address you see right there on your screen. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.